The numbers dropped quietly. No press conference. No dramatic announcement. Just a Reuters poll showing 38%. The lowest approval rating since Trump took office again. And the moment I saw it, I thought, this one's going to tell us something bigger. Because it's not just about polls. It's about grocery bills that haven't come down. Gas prices that keep climbing. Rent checks that swallow half your paycheck. People voted for change, and they're still waiting for it to show up in their bank accounts. It's like watching someone promise to clear the clouds, but the sky stays gray. Here's the paradox. Trump won because people wanted something different, but his approval is dropping because different hasn't arrived yet. And behind the numbers, there's a story about expectations, economics, and how fast political capital burns when promises collide with reality. Stick with me, because once you see how all the pieces fit together, the picture changes. Let me take you inside what's actually happening. Wellen, don't active relses, while round of relses, while an active relses. So let's start with what actually triggered this. The Reuters poll came out on November 18th, and the headline number was stark. 38% approval. Now, if you're not paying close attention to these things, that might just sound like another data point. But in Washington, 38% is a flashing red light. Because here's the context. When Trump was inaugurated for his second term, his approval was sitting somewhere in the mid-50s. Not great by historical standards, but solid enough to have political capital, enough to push an agenda, enough to keep his party united. That was just a few months ago, and now we're at 38. That's not a dip. That's a collapse. The Reuters report didn't just give us a number. It gave us reasons. 2 of them. Actually, the first one you'd expect. Americans are unhappy about his handling of the high cost of living, groceries, gas, rent, the basics that eat into every paycheck. People voted for change, and they're not seeing it yet, where it matters most, in their wallets. The second reason caught more attention, the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein. Now, this isn't new territory. Epstein's been dead for years. Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison. But the documents keep coming, the investigations keep grinding forward, and Trump's name keeps appearing in the headlines. Not because there's new evidence of wrongdoing, but because the story never really goes away. But here's where it gets complicated. These 2 factors, cost of living and Epstein, they're operating on completely different levels. One is material reality. The other is symbolic, reputational, emotional. And when you combine them, when economic frustration meets persistent controversy, approval doesn't just fall, it craters. I spent the morning going through the crosstabs, looking at who's turning away and why. It's not just Democrats or independents, though they're definitely part of the story. It's working-class voters in swing states. It's suburban families who voted for Trump because they wanted lower prices and more stability. It's people who don't follow political drama closely, but do notice when their monthly budget gets tighter, and the news stays negative. Think about what that means for a moment. 38% isn't just unpopularity. It's a threshold. Below 40%. You start losing operational control. Members of your own party begin hedging their bets. Donors start making quiet phone calls. Legislative priorities that once seemed achievable suddenly face resistance, because nobody wants to be too closely associated with a president whose numbers are sinking. Political capital, the ability to get things done in Washington, doesn't decline gradually. It evaporates. And right now, it's evaporating fast. Behind closed doors, Republicans are getting nervous. Not panicking yet, but asking questions. How do we distance ourselves without looking disloyal? How do we support the agenda without being dragged down by the approval rating? How do we survive midterms if this trajectory continues? So you've got this tension between campaign promises and governing reality, between what was supposed to happen and what's actually happening, between the momentum Trump rode back into office and the friction he's hitting now that he's there. And that friction, it's not going away anytime soon. Pinky was oxygenated in a crisis sense, in a crisis, in a positive, in a crisis. Now, step back for a second, because once you understand what shifted behind the scenes, everything looks different. This isn't abstract political theater. This is about your life, about the family down the street, trying to stretch their grocery budget one more week, about the single mom filling her gas tank, watching the numbers climb higher than they were 6 months ago, about the young couple who thought maybe, finally, they'd be able to afford rent without needing 3 roommates. Think about what that means for a moment. During the campaign, Trump talked constantly about bringing prices down. Drill, baby, drill. Cut regulations. Unleash American energy. Make groceries affordable again. And people believed him, or at least, hoped he was right. They voted for that promise. They bet their financial future on it. But here's the reality. Meat prices haven't dropped. Milk still costs what it did during the election. Vegetables, bread, the basics in every shopping trip, they're all still expensive. Some are even higher. And when you're living paycheck to paycheck, when you're choosing between filling your tank and buying groceries, you notice. You don't need a poll to tell you nothing has changed. You see it every time you check out at the register. Gas prices follow the same story. Trump promised energy dominance, promised lower costs at the pump. And to be fair, energy policy takes time. You can't drill your way to cheap gas overnight. Supply chains don't reorganize themselves because a new president arrives. But voters don't think in policy timelines. They think in monthly budgets. And right now, their budget is just as tight as before. Rent is another pressure point. In cities, suburbs, even small towns, housing costs keep climbing. Landlords aren't lowering rent because there's a new administration. Developers aren't suddenly building affordable housing. The economic fundamentals that drove costs up, they're still in place, and families are still struggling. But then, there's the other factor, the Epstein investigation. Now, this is where things get tricky. Because for most Americans, Epstein isn't a daily concern. They're not following every document release, every headline, but it's there, a constant drip of negative news. And when you're already frustrated about the cost of living, when you're already feeling like promises aren't being kept, that background noise becomes foreground. It's not that the investigation by itself tanks approval. It's that it gives people something to point at. When they're already unhappy, it becomes symbolic of something larger, a sense that maybe the focus isn't where it needs to be, that maybe attention is being pulled away from the economic issues that matter most. Behind closed doors, Republican strategists are watching these numbers and doing math. 38% approval doesn't just make Trump unpopular, it makes him a liability. Every Republican running in a competitive district in 2026 is now calculating, do I embrace the president and risk going down with him? Or do I distance myself and risk angering the base? That calculation, that tension inside the party, it affects real policy. Budget votes get harder. Legislative priorities stall. The agenda that was supposed to move quickly starts grinding slowly. Because when approval is low, political capital evaporates. And without political capital, even a president from your own party can't move his people. This isn't just about Trump's popularity. It's about whether he can actually deliver what he promised. before voters decide they've had enough. And, right now, the clock is ticking. Where there are finest hand, awful is reeling twos, and hander, a tenery. Let's go back a bit, because this story isn't new. Every president, regardless of party, regardless of promises, hits this wall. The honeymoon period ends. The gap between campaign rhetoric and governing reality shows up, and approval ratings begin their inevitable slide. Obama had it. Biden had it. Trump's first term, same story. You come in with momentum, with hope, with a mandate from voters who believed in change, and then you run into the machinery of Washington, the constraints of economics, the reality that most problems don't have quick fixes. That gap between expectation and delivery. That's where approval ratings go to die. We've seen this movie before. The plot doesn't change much. What changes is how fast it happens, and how far the numbers fall. Cost of living is the perfect example of a problem with no magic solution. Inflation doesn't reverse because there's a new president. The Federal Reserve sets interest rates based on complex dynamics that have nothing to do with who sits in the Oval Office. Supply chains disrupted during the pandemic. They're still recovering. Corporate pricing power, the ability to raise prices without losing customers. That doesn't disappear overnight. You can't executive order grocery prices down. You can't tweet gas prices lower. These are structural issues that take years to resolve, not months. But voters don't think in years. They think in grocery trips, gas station visits, monthly bills that keep arriving, whether the economy is improving or not. And then there's the Epstein case. This isn't the first time Trump's name appeared in documents related to Epstein. It won't be the last. The media loves this story because it's sensational, because it generates clicks, outrage, speculation. Every few months, a new batch of documents drops. Every few months, the headlines return. And every time the actual content matters less than the fact that the story is still alive. It's a pattern. Big headlines, intense scrutiny, careful examination of what's actually in the documents, realization there's nothing new or incriminating. The story fades until the next release, and the cycle repeats. But here's what's different this time. The timing. When the economy was strong, when people felt secure, these controversies were easier to dismiss as political noise. But when you're stressed about money, when you're frustrated that promises haven't been kept, that background noise becomes harder to ignore. I've been watching interviews with voters the past few weeks. The frustration is real. People are confused. They voted for change, and they're asking why everything still feels the same. Why is rent still high? Why are groceries still expensive? Why does it feel like nothing is actually different? That confusion, that sense of betrayal, even, isn't irrational. These are people who took Trump at his word, who believed the promises, who thought maybe this time things would actually change. And now, they're realizing that change is harder and slower than they were told it would be. The trap isn't that Trump lied. The trap is that he promised things. No president can deliver quickly, and now he's paying the price for that gap between promise and reality. And now, electot casta and sponder stater. So here's what's really happening underneath all the noise. Approval ratings aren't vanity metrics. They're currency. In Washington, approval is the difference between getting things done and watching your agenda die in committee. It's leverage. And right now, that leverage is disappearing. Think about it this way. When a president has high approval, members of Congress from his own party want to be seen with him. They want his endorsement. They want to tie themselves to his success. Donors open their wallets, media coverage softens, and even opponents think twice before blocking his priorities, because they know the public is behind him. But when approval drops below 40%, everything inverts. Members of Congress start hedging. They support the president in private, but avoid being photographed with him. Donors make quiet calls, asking if their money is backing a winner or a sinking ship. Media smells blood, and coverage turns sharper. Opponents get bolder. They see weakness, and they push harder. It's not personal. It's survival instinct. Politicians are reading the same polls everyone else is, and they're doing math. If the president's approval is 38%, and I'm in a competitive district, do I really want to tie my fate to his? Or do I start creating distance just in case? That calculation happens behind closed doors. But the effects show up in real policy. Budget votes that should be straightforward suddenly face resistance. Legislative priorities that seemed achievable get delayed. Appointments stall. The machinery of government, which depends on cooperation and political will, starts grinding slower. Here's where it gets interesting. The economy might actually be improving by traditional metrics. GDP could be growing. Unemployment could be stable. The stock market could be hitting new highs. But none of that matters if people don't feel it in their daily lives. Approval doesn't track economic data. It tracks economic perception. And right now, perception is everything. When you're standing in a grocery store, looking at prices that haven't come down, GDP growth doesn't help you. When you fill your gas tank, and it costs the same as it did 6 months ago, unemployment numbers don't make you feel better. People don't live inside economic indicators. They live inside grocery bills, rent checks, gas station receipts. That's the mechanism. Approval falls when the gap between promise and perception gets too wide. And once it falls, political capital evaporates. And without political capital, even good policy becomes nearly impossible to pass. It becomes a feedback loop. Low approval makes governing harder. Harder governing means fewer wins. Fewer wins keep approval low. I've seen this pattern before in business. When a company's strategy isn't working, when results don't match projections, leadership either adapts or doubles down. The ones who adapt survive. The ones who double down, who insist the strategy is fine, and everyone else is wrong, they don't. The question now is which path this administration takes. So here we are. Approval at 38%. Midterms, 18 months away. Cost of living still squeezing families. And Washington watching to see what happens next. The pressure is building from every direction. Every Republican in a competitive House seat is already thinking about 2026. They're looking at Trump's numbers and doing the math. Can I afford to be too closely associated with an administration whose approval is tanking? Or do I need to start building distance now, before it's too late? Senate races are even tighter. Margins are razor thin. Losing just a few seats could flip control. And no candidate wants to be the one who went down because they tied themselves to a sinking approval rating. That calculation, loyalty versus survival, is happening behind closed doors right now. Trump historically doesn't pivot. He doubles down. When he faces criticism, when polls turn against him, his instinct is to push harder, not adjust course. That's been his pattern for years. The real question now is this time different? Is the pressure intense enough to force a strategic shift? The most obvious pivot would be economic messaging, refocusing everything on cost of living, on tangible results people can feel, less energy on controversies, more energy on groceries, gas, rent, paychecks. That would be the smart play. Whether it actually happens is another question. Because here's the fundamental problem. Cost of living isn't going to magically improve. The Federal Reserve won't dramatically cut rates. Supply chains are still stabilizing. Corporate pricing power is still strong. The forces that drove prices up are still baked into the economy. And that means families will keep feeling squeezed. And as long as families feel squeezed, as long as they're choosing between groceries and gas, as long as rent eats half a paycheck, approval stays under pressure. Voters don't judge presidents by intentions. They judge them by outcomes, by whether life actually got better. Right now, for a lot of Americans, it hasn't. They voted for change, and they're still waiting for it to show up where it matters, in their bank accounts, in their monthly budgets, in the total at the grocery store. The clock is ticking. Midterms are coming. The question isn't whether Trump can turn this around. The question is whether there's enough time for the economy to improve in a way people can actually feel before they vote again. Because political capital, once it's gone, is almost impossible to rebuild. And right now, it's burning faster than anyone expected. If this helped you see the moment more clearly, share your perspective below. Not to agree or disagree, but to observe. Approval ratings don't exist in a vacuum. They reflect real frustration, real pressure, real families trying to make ends meet, while waiting for promises to become reality. And when that gap, the gap between campaign rhetoric and grocery store receipts, gets too wide, political capital burns. We're watching it happen in real time. 38% isn't just a number. It's a signal. The honeymoon is over. The hard part of governing has begun. So, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you're seeing in your own life. Are prices coming down? Is change showing up in your paycheck? Or are you still waiting for promises to become reality? Because your answers matter more than any poll. They're the difference between political momentum and political survival. And right now, the pressure is rising faster than anyone expected. The only question left is whether there's enough time to turn it around before voters make their next